This is Pacific Landscapes through the Holocene from east to west. That's part two. I'm Fred Damon, and I'm the chair for this one, and I want to say something to begin with, is that most of us didn't really quite know one another, but I came across Tom Thornton's work a couple of years ago and found it fascinating. He works on the northwest coast, and I thought, geez, it kind of looks like those Indians are doing things quite similar to what the Asian Australians are doing in my sort of scheme of things. That is, making the environment in which they're living. So I asked Tom if he would participate in this. And when Steve and I were talking about the structure of this thing, he said, well, how about also asking Sandra Blakey? She works in the Mediterranean, and I thought that was kind of far afield, but he pointed out is that she has been very stimulated by his work. So that, if you will, if in fact her place falls out of the geographical range of the initial definition of our project, in fact, she represents the sort of true anthropological experience where we learn from one another's respective work and therefore form this community. So the beginning and ends of our sequence are, if you will, extreme versions of the Pacific. Anyway, it's now Thomas Thornton's pleasure to do us These Mountains Saved a Lot of People.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about alpine cairns. These are rock piles basically on the tops of mountains. You find them all up and down the Pacific coast, both sides actually, and lots of other places. And I did a project with a couple of archaeologists who I'll introduce, but just to give you a flavor of cairns, I'd like to play a little bit and show you one.
Look at all these rocks. And look at the size of these rocks that are piled on top of one another. And it's interesting that if rocks didn't have any kind of meaning, what would be the purpose? Why would anybody do this type of thing? This is material, but it also shouts the spirit of a human being's endeavor to survive. It speaks louder than all the written books. This tells a story. This tells a story of survival.
It's sort of a pretentious title. The reason is this was originally put together to convince physicists. And thought I'd better stick with that title. So now we'll see what my colleagues think of it. So here we are, lessons from Balinese water temples. And I'll move quickly along. That's the goddess of Lake Batur, goddess of waters in Bali, and there's a mosaic formed by the activity of the farmers in Bali. Alina Ostrom, when she got her Nobel Prize award in Stockholm, it was given to her for analysis of economic governance, especially the commons, and her favorite examples came from irrigation systems in Asia, and it was about how governance rules ultimately determine the success or failure of common property rights regimes. And Balinese subaks were one of her second favorite examples after the Nepalese cases. So in Bali, subaks manage irrigation. These are associations of farmers who share water from a common source, like Lisa's people in Timor. But they're small, average size, maybe 80 farmers, 40 hectares, 2 orders of magnitude, well, anyway, roughly that size. Bali has steeply sloping volcanic hillsides, so the Balinese have been building irrigation systems, digging tunnels since the 9th century to lead the water from the bottom of rivers to the top of a terraced hillside, and then everyone who shares water from a particular source, in this case you see 2 canals feeding 2 subaks, owe offerings to the goddess for the gift of water at that site. Water is then led down, and for 1,000 years they've been terracing the hillsides, so that's what they look like. To make this work, since the whole thing is built out of mud and rock, the water flow has to be very carefully maintained, and of course it's shared. So there's a typical Balinese river. You can see the water as it flows over that fresh volcanic soil, picks up minute particles of pumice, it gets a cutting edge, and it slices channels deep down, and it moves fast in the rainy season. So it's a challenge to make this work, but they've got it together. Water has to be shared, and in addition to delivering water to the fields to flood the paddy and grow the rice, they also see to it that large enough areas are flooded at the same time to control rice pests like rats and insects and diseases carried by insects. Here's an example of a flooding episode when they were having a large plague of pests in Tabanan Regency. So many subaks collaborated to create that fallow. Bear in mind, all this is built by hand, right? And what they're doing is maintaining that fallow just for a short period of time, long enough to starve out the pests, except the ones that are right on the periphery of the terraces.
1975, 76. The Green Revolution had just begun. The Green Revolution means the introduction of Western farming techniques, basically. It's high-yielding plants that are designed to grow quickly, along with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So this came as a package to the Balinese farmers. The farmers were told, in the interests of national development, take this new rice and plant just as fast as you can. If you can get 3 crops a year, great. Some of the old people said, well, the trouble with that is, according to our traditional system, we schedule, we carefully time when the water goes into the fields and when it doesn't, and there are reasons for that.
After a couple of years of bumper harvests, those reasons started to become clear. Stephen Lansing's old friend, Wayan Pega, is a farmer in Sebatu. He remembers what it was like 20 years ago when the pests began to appear.
Waktu sekitar tahun 80 kan tuh udah diulang lagi.
The Green Revolution remedy for pests was pesticides. It's not just that the farmers were advised to use pesticides, they were forced to use pesticides. They would be punished by the government if they didn't, because the government would say, if anybody doesn't use pesticides immediately, as soon as any sign of pests appear, then the pests will spread to other fields. So within a year or two, even the farmers, pumping these pesticides into their fields couldn't kill all the pests. The government then began to fly the island, dropping pesticides from airplanes, and they succeeded in killing damn near everything.
Itu kepercayaan tetap fungsinya kepada Sang Pencipta, karena segala yang hidup itu ditentukan oleh Sang Pencipta.
He says that everything is made by a creator, and so by disturbing anything, by killing anything, you're disturbing part of the creation. So you need to pay attention to the whole picture. Essentially saying you have to pay attention to the whole picture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that, Stephen told me, was the role of the water temple. Looking at the whole picture, applying wisdom accumulated over centuries.
In the middle courtyard of the temple, the farmers gather every month. They make decisions in a democratic assembly on how they're going to plant.
Yeah. So how does this work? All of those decisions are made at the local level by these small subaks aggregated into water temples, but the ritual system claims that it's a universal system, that it encompasses the whole island, and for years I've wondered if that could possibly be true in some way. So here's Bali. Here's a little piece of Bali. The green areas, different colored areas are subocs, so that's rice growing. At different stages, you can tell by the color, and then the kind of brown things are the villages. So it's a patchwork, it's a kind of a mosaic. Here we've colored the rice growing areas. These are the rice terraces, colored different colors, okay? And the question becomes then, why this pattern, each of them generated by local decisions? So we take a look at one suboc. Is it in fact independent? Or is it part of a larger system as the ritual system proclaims? So here's a model balancing the trade-off between water sharing and pest control by synchronized harvests. Simple thing on a lattice. Every little dot is a suboc. The colors are the irrigation schedules. We assign them randomly, so red might mean plant in January and in August, something like that. Anyway, random irrigation. And then run it for a year. At the end of the year, every suboc decides what to plant next, what to do, and they compare with their neighbors. So the guy in green in the middle there discovers that his red neighbor got the best harvest, so choose red. That's all there is to it. So, oops, except I've got to make this go in the right direction. Oh yeah, so the effect of that is, at the start, there are lots of pests. They can migrate from field to field. Sorry, get this going. But later on, as the system starts to adapt, you get little patches that are doing the same thing, which helps to control the pests, because they go fallow at the same time. Equal-sized patches emerge. Fewer pests, more rice, but the thing doesn't stop. It keeps evolving until it forms a configuration like that, which looks a little more like those images that I just showed you. And what's interesting about it is at that point, the simulation stops. Nobody can do better. Harvests are optimized. And it's Pareto optimal, meaning any change will lower the harvest. So in this simple little simulation, the transition from local to global control happens at a particular moment and optimizes the harvests. So it goes like this, from random to mini patches to one system. That's a phase transition. Talking now to the physicists, right? It's a transition from local to global control. And it looks an awful lot like what happens when you lower the temperature in magnetizable metals. As you drop the temperature, then the spins of the metal particles align into patches, and at the phase transition, which is called the critical point, they become connected. So here's the evolution of a magnet. Here's the evolution of the subocs. Difference is with the magnet, the moment of transition is just a phase. If you lower the temperature further, then the patches will get larger and larger until finally they all become aligned. It becomes one solid thing. It's as magnetic as it can be. And if you heat it up again, then gradually it will lose its magnetic attraction. In the case of the subocs, it stops exactly at the critical transition in this little model. So that's how it goes. Magnetism. You go to the magnetic form, and in this model, we go to Pareto optimality. Question is, does it bear any resemblance to what actually happens in Bali? So here's another coded, observation from Google Earth of rice terraces in Bali. The frequency of the different size patches follows a power law, meaning there are lots of little patches and progressively fewer large ones. But in addition, crucially, the correlation distances, that is how correlated one patch is to its next neighbor going out in any direction, follows a power law too, meaning I'm more closely related to my nearest neighbor and a little less to my next nearest neighbor, and so forth down the line. True for all of them. That's the second power law. So that was interesting when we tried it for the first time. So we tried it again, picking days that weren't cloudy in Google Earth, and we get the same relationship. And once again. So finally, after 13 tries, we said, okay, it looks like there really is a phase transition here. Like it's an icing model in physics, or it's a Potts model, it's a standard, it's a thing that undergraduate physics students learn. The difference here, however, is that it is endogenous. With the magnet, some external hand has to change the temperature. In this case, it's the process of adaptation that takes this system to what's called self-organized criticality. Self-organized criticality. And this, to me, is maybe the most convincing picture. Here we can vary in the model the relative effect of pest and water stresses, and the correlation length, as you see in the middle diagonal there, is the phase transition. That occurs when they balance. And that little area bounded by those two wet lines is where all the real data is found. That's the phase transition. Okay? So why was this not noticed in the past? Theoretical ecologists have been looking at community ecology and discovering that there is a power law relationship also for vegetation that's undergoing stress. So in a savanna, there's often as the system goes into a stress phase, then the very largest patches start to disappear. But that's relatively easy to see because all of the patches are more or less, they look the same, they're very similar. In the case of the rice paddies, the different colors have functional significance. They mean that the rice is at a different stage. And so that's harder to see. They didn't really look very organized if you think back to those photographs, that in fact they are at the critical transition phase. So what does that mean? Well, to stay there, to actually maintain the globals, to maintain everybody moving in this way such that that system will be sustained, needs cooperation. And that takes us to a water goddess. So here, at the end of the year, of the Balinese year, 220 villages come up to bring offerings to the goddess at her temple on the crater lake in token of thanks for the harvest that she's made possible by her gift of water. And here we have one of the high priests explaining what the Pula Kriti is. Pula is origin, Kriti is goodness. He's explaining why it's to everyone's advantage to follow this system. We can all see that we've all had bountiful harvests. So this happens every year, the full moon in the 10th month. They are pretty happy as what they're putting into the Pula Kriti is a little bit of what grew in everybody's field. And it's a moment to celebrate, perhaps. It's a moment of success. Okay, so I'm almost done, actually. It's the fastest I've given this talk. Here's that temple as it was. 1917, there's a wall of lava that stopped just before the entrance. The temple that you've just seen in those photographs, later on there was another volcanic eruption, and that temple moved up to the rim where you can now visit it on the rim of Mount Batur. Here are the great-grandsons of the dancers in the original photograph. That system still continues. It's still very important to the Balinese, but the Dutch who observe this, everybody who observes this think it's a wonderful, colorful celebration. But it has been invisible to planners. It's a colorful ritual. And at the same time, there's been a crisis in Balinese where they lose about 1,000 hectares of subak land, of rice land every year, and the system is threatened, I think largely because it's been invisible. Even the Balinese who are participating at the local level they have the ritual system that tells them that it's a universal system, but they don't actually experience it as such, except as a ritual system. So it's hard to kind of pull these pieces apart. And the reason I think there are lessons here is that if I'm right about all this, it's not going to be true only in Bali. And we just done a paper in PNAS called Adaptive Self-Organized Criticality, or words to that effect. If you take a frame of Google Earth and look at some landscape that people have been interacting with, you can easily calculate the correlation distances and ask what scale of organization is going on here, what pattern has emerged. And I think we should be doing that. I think that there are probably similar systems elsewhere that we would not have noticed, just as we didn't notice what was going on. I mean, I've been studying the subaks for years and finally figured out what was going on at this sort of higher level scheme of coordination. And I guess that's the last. What we're doing now, I'll just, in 15 seconds, that's measuring methane and nitrous oxide emissions from the rice paddies. By changing the irrigation schedule, it should be possible to duplicate the results they've had at the University of California in Davis, which is to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. So we're about to see if that'll work in Bali. Thank you.
Okay, the last of our data presentations, Sandra Blake from Emory University, Ritual Ecology and Comparison from Indonesia into the Aegean.
That's not her slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's Miriam. Sorry.
Miriam's next?
Yes, Miriam's
Okay.
next. I'm sorry.
I am Miriam.
Thank you for getting it right. Miriam Starr cannot be here, so one of her colleagues and our discussant, Jonathan Padway, will be presenting her paper.
This is the clicker, is that right? Okay. All right, I'll try to do justice to Miriam's paper. Southeast Asia has always been central to the Pacific region, whose ocean comprises more than 1/3 of the Earth's surface and whose peoples occupy land masses from East Africa to the Pitcairn Islands. The region is central to human evolution narratives for early human ancestors, for increasingly early evidence of animal and plant domestication, and for its seafaring Austronesian farmers who colonized islands across the region. More than a millennium before the first Arab traders reached Southeast Asia, the region's river valleys served as crucibles for early cities and states. 3rd century dynastic annals describe multiple competing polities that ringed the South China Sea and engaged with the Chinese court through tribute and trade. Built on agrarian foundations, these polities expanded in scale and influence to become 9th through 15th century states and empires. Most collapsed before European contact and reconfigured to take advantage of a world of burgeoning maritime trade. Angkor was the largest of Southeast Asia's, that looks like the polities, yeah? Okay, so I think I might be one slide off, excuse me. Okay, now I'm complete. Is that Angkor?
Yep.
Okay. Angkor was the largest of Southeast Asia's pre-modern states, and its civilizational trajectory involves cycles of collapse and regeneration. Understanding this long-term history requires attention to synergies between social action and natural environment generated landscape histories, and archaeologists are well positioned to study these inextricably cultural and physical embodiments of human time. Angkor, in all its manifestations, arose within and was ultimately circumscribed by the Mekong River Basin. Its deep history is ideal for understanding what Frederick Damon describes as a comparatively unique mode of action to pursue in situ modes of existence. And anthropological archaeology offers an apt lens for studying social action through landscape manipulations, variable cosmological systems, and modes of production intrinsic to this way of life. Okay, I want to make sure that we're on the correct. Please jump in and help me understand if I am not on the correct slide, because I think I'm a little off here. I use 3 archaeological case studies from the lower Mekong to examine the region's deep historical ecology. By examining agrarian landscape production, Angkorian period forest use, and the construction of ritual landscapes. The use of landscape as an analytical unit is hardly new to archaeology. Neither is the notion that humans create landscapes through individual and collective action. I hope to demonstrate, however, that archaeology is an excellent lens for viewing landscapes as physical narratives of everyday life, and that these Mekong landscapes reflect dialectical transformations as Khmers shaped and responded to their rivers, their forests, and their ancestors for more than 2 millennia. All right. My first example concerns agrarian land use in the first millennium CE. That is way back here. How about we get back there? There we go. Does that make sense? Let's hope. My first example concerns agrarian land use in the first millennium CE state that preceded Angkor in the Mekong Delta. Okay, I was right. I'm sorry. The Delta. Today, the Mekong Delta covers an area of about 55,000 square kilometers, 70% of which falls within Vietnam. Its northern reaches extend into southern Cambodia, which is one of Cambodia's most productive farming areas. The region's humid tropical climate is shaped by the annual monsoon. High seasonal rainfall each May to November causes its Mekong and Basak rivers to overflow their banks, and protracted annual droughts from December through April translate into dramatic landscape dynamics. Back mangrove swamps for more than 5 millennia okay, that's not even a sentence, pardon me. Much of southern Cambodia today is a patchwork of rice fields, wetlands, and shrubland whose waterways contain abundant aquatic resources. Until the early first millennium CE, however, the region hosted back mangrove swamps. Aquatic products comprise 75% of protein in the Cambodian diet today, and Khmer's fish primarily in the rainy season. The riverine Mekong Delta, with its back swamps and marshes, has supported nearly 4 millennia of agricultural production. Khmer farmers today cultivate rain-fed, deep-water, and irrigated rice fields in Cambodia's Mekong Delta, and the latter fringe Cambodia's southern border with Vietnam. They farm year-round, using transplanting and broadcasting methods on more than 2,000 different rice varieties to maximize yields across their fields, which range up to 2 to 3 tons per hectare. Lowland areas within Cambodia's Mekong Delta today present a patchwork of rice plots, most of which still rely on rain-fed farming techniques. Proportionally little of the country's southern provinces rely on canal irrigation, and long-term fieldwork by the Lower Mekong Archaeological Project, known as LOMAP, suggests that farmers colonized and then thrived in the Mekong Delta precisely because they mastered the art of working with, rather than against, the wetland environment in which they lived. Okay. The LOMAP research from 1996 to 2009 focused on the Takeo River and Angkor Boré Basin in Takeo Province to document the origins and occupational sequence of its primary early center, Angkor Boré, and to understand the region's history of human settlement. 6 years of archaeological field research in the LOMAP area has documented enduring agrarian landscape modifications and offers 3 key insights. First, the late Holocene history of this region witnessed a retreat of mangrove and the emergence of swamp and riparian forest that made wetland rice farming increasingly attractive to human populations. The Mekong Delta assumed its basic form by the mid-Holocene and supported some human groups. Humans did not colonize the region en masse until they held knowledge of farming with the floods. Shifts from river terraces onto adjacent floodplains occurred throughout the region, from the Karat Plateau to the upper Mekong Delta in the first millennium BCE. Protohistoric Mekong Delta populations were rice farmers, but they did not carry the weight of transplanted irrigated rice agriculture. This is a quote of Fred Damon's work. They instead used non-intensive wetland farming techniques that proved so useful that little convincing evidence exists even in the following Angkorian period for a conversion to conventional paddy agriculture. They used planted rice in receding floodwaters to double their annual crop yield, and likely dug canals to divert the muddy floodwaters onto fields to deposit fertilizing mud in the time-honored colmatage system that Khmer farmers still employ. Visiting Chinese emissaries described the kingdom of Funan that rested on this firm agrarian base by the 3rd century. Protohistoric farmers across the Mekong Delta sculpted farming systems around their local hydrology to reap surpluses and build cities. Angkorian Khmers had different relationships with their forests, which ringed their lowland farmscapes and defined the Khmer lowlands. They adapted their protohistoric farming to the floodplains they inhabited, but they imposed particular visions upon their natural landscapes, like forests. By the 7th century CE, inscriptional evidence suggests that Khmer farmers settled on arable lands throughout most of the Mekong lowlands, from the Mekong Delta north to southern Laos and westward to central Thailand. Away from riverine areas, mangrove or mixed deciduous dipterocarp forests covered these regions. Archaeological patterning suggests pre-Angkorian settlement preference along major waterways and in broad alluvial plains, and intensive land modification that characterized populations across mainland Southeast Asia. Forest clearance activities affected areas hundreds of kilometers distant from Greater Angkor, like Ratanakiri, which is in the uplands. We doubt that Angkorian Khmers inhabited these forested uplands, though they erected stone temples in such localities. Epigraphic data paint a lowland Angkorian world of villages, orchards, and rice fields. Jacob's 1993 analysis of inscriptional data produced few incontrovertibly wild forest animals, for instance, python, tiger, and elephant. Only about 10% of named plants were directly associated with forests, and one lone dipterocarp was listed as occurring in both forests and rice fields. Land clearance for farmland and timber harvesting for construction went hand in hand, and the Angkorian metropolis was an insatiable consumer of timber for temple construction, the establishment of royal residential palaces, and their associated wooden buildings. Angkorian Khmers traded with their non-Khmer neighbors to meet Chinese demands for forest goods, like kingfisher feathers for elite jewelry, elephant tusks, rhino horns, beeswax, and fragrant woods. Such demand for Cambodia's forest products may have reduced 10th to 14th century forests that flanked the Angkorian lowlands during Southeast Asia's early age of commerce. A 10th to 13th century CE surge in maritime trade persisted into the 15th century, and Cambodia was enmeshed in a tributary relationship with China that involved trade concessions. Lower Mekong forests were a major source of aromatic woods in 14th century trade networks. Garu wood was important, and medicinal woods gained currency by the end of the early modern period. Mekong forests, both mangrove and deciduous, were key to provisioning the capital and its provinces with fuel for industrial-scale metallurgical and high-fired stoneware production. Recent work on stoneware ceramic production that has been documented in Greater Angkor and some of its satellite centers, like Preh Khan of Kampong Svai, recent work has documented this. While nuances in the relationship between industrial production and deforestation in pre-modern economies remain complex, both kiln-based iron and stoneware ceramic production required substantial charcoal supplies. Iron smelting activity at Phnom Dek, near Preh Khan of Kampong Svai, may have generated 50,000 metric tons of slag in a protracted period from the late 12th through 14th centuries. My last example focuses on how Khmers crafted ever larger ritual landscapes through the 1st and 2nd millennia CE. Humans create landscapes through repeated action. Khmer spirits animate natural places today, places with agency and the power to interact positively or negatively with humans who move through them. Even the most benign of these are ancestral guardian spirits and require regular supplication and care. Here we see examples of contemporary spirit Nekta shrines from southern Cambodia. Pre-Angkorian Khmers defined the boundaries of their lands by installing brick shrines to house their ancestral spirits in caves, at springs, in villages, and in rice fields. These Nekta inhabited ever larger sacred spaces and took ever larger forms. Shrines became brick temples, and by the 9th century CE, such shrines were prasats that anchored hamlets across the Angkorian countryside. The Angkorian capital and its provincial centers gradually filled up with massive state temples as each successive ruler dedicated religious monuments to his ancestors upon ascension to the throne. Angkorian Khmers worked within rather than against natural features in crafting their ritual landscapes. They carved into stream beds to sacralize their waterways and erected sandstone Hindu temples along the rim of an extinct volcano and atop steep cliffs to overlook their rice plains. Jayavarman VII's establishment of his 13th century city of Angkor Thom, replete with a royal palace, multiple temples, elite residential quarters, and open plazas for public events, represented the apex of Angkorian ritual landscapes. Roads radiated out in several directions to channel the flow of people, goods, and pageantry into and through the great city. The Lower Mekong Basin's archaeological record is a history of social action and reflects the deep historical ecology that is synonymous with Khmer civilization's 2,500-year-long history. To argue that Khmers lived in harmony with their environment would be inaccurate and counterproductive. I've used these 3 case studies to illustrate different types of Khmer engagement with the environment in the pre-modern era. Collective Angkorian action rerouted waterways, generated monumental urbanism, and made an Indic order their very being. Yet the development of massive hydraulic engineering projects at Angkor also damaged settlement and prompted the collapse of Angkor as a capital and a political movement southward. Different kinds of engagements with their natural environments, moderated through dense networks of coordinated social relations, could be a source of both social resilience and political vulnerability. I'll stop there. There's a couple more points that she's got, but I think I'll try to address them later.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, now we get Sandra.
I do.
That's yours. Is that the first one?
I'd like to begin by thanking Fred and Steve for their interest and their sense of humor, sufficient to take up a very big question: why compare the Aegean and the Pacific? Comparative studies between Aegean and Pacific cultures have been few, despite promising analogies between the two regions. The Mediterranean is defined by micro-regional fragmentation, uneven distribution of resources, and climatic and environmental uncertainties, all factors with analogs in Pacific cultures. These raised the Strategic Alliance on Maritime Connectivity. It was the sea that made Mediterranean life possible. The geospatial range of the Greek world, from the Black Sea in the north to Sicily in the east and Egypt in the south, offers analogy to the great catchment of the Pacific cultures and reinforces the strength of ties over water. Shipbuilding technologies long dominated studies of Mediterranean mobility. More recently, the focus has shifted to how human landscapes enable movement, interaction, and exchange through mythopoiesis and metaphor. Among these are the naming practices which fix in Cartesian space the embodied experiences of sailors and narratives of ancient travelers. So the Greek sailors put in at Odysseus's cave in Ithaca, shrines of Dioscoroi in the Adriatic, or cities named for the same sons of Zeus in the Black Sea. A further commonality suggests one reason the comparisons have lagged: shared notions of an ultimate incomparability. Included in the call for today's session was the hypothesis that Pacific landscapes reflect a comparatively unique mode of action. The hypothesis of a distinct cultural, geographical, and environmental unity has been a lasting, if disputed, framework for Mediterranean investigations. That impetus for disciplinary insularity is compounded by the defining role of Greek and Roman literature in Mediterranean archaeology. These are the canonical texts of classical philology, and the canon brings with it a profound disinclination to comparative studies. The ecological approaches of today's session, moreover, challenges us to integrate data and analysis from what remain very separate activities within Mediterranean archaeology and construe the text-archaeology relationship in an entirely different way than 19th century traditions would dictate. A comparison between an Aegean and Pacific ritual system, the mystery cult of the great gods of Samothrace from the Mediterranean, and the water temples of Bali, as Steve Lansing has analyzed them, suggest the potential for taking up this challenge. The mysteries promised initiates safety in travel at sea, responding directly to the economically critical factor of mobility. Comparison with the water temple system raises the hypothesis that the promise was made real through the social structures for collaboration, information sharing, and pacts of non-aggression. In the short space of this paper, I'll focus on 3 points. The first is the link between the cognized and operational realms, reflected in Indonesia and the relationship between subaks and water temples, in the Greek context between civic honors of proxenia and the promises made to initiates. The second is the question of a trade-off, as participants bind themselves to social choices that sacrifice local profits in favor of longer-term regional benefits. Discussions within the subaks balance incentives between the upstream and downstream users. Greeks affiliated with Samothrace surrendered the profits of piracy and harbor fees, but in turn were free from predation and able to turn their own ports into emporia for the information flows essential to maritime success. Network analysis of the proxenic decrees raises the potential, finally, to model a hypothesis of the emergence of the Samothracian system from smaller local networks, analogous to models of the Balinese temples as self-organizing emergent systems. The island of Samothrace was positioned at the intersection of 2 seas, 2 continents, and multiple cultures: the Greeks to the south and west, the Thracians to the north, and the Phrygians in Asia Minor. It rises from the collision of the northeastern Aegean plates, Most of its 180 square kilometers consists of the great mountain Fengari, which at 1,664 meters is the highest peak of the Aegean. It was visible from 100 miles away. Poseidon was said to have sat on its peak to watch the battle on the plains of Troy. Its multiple names reflect the perspectives of sailors, the claims of maritime safety, and the Greek-Thracian interactions in the region. The mountain was Fengari, moon or gleaming one, and Lacosia, white, appropriate for the clouds which cluster at its height. The Samos in Samothrace recalls the Greek word saved, resonant with the myth told by Diodorus Siculus. Long ago, when a primordial flood first burst the boundary between the Black and Mediterranean seas, Samothrace's mountain was surrounded by low-lying plains. These were entirely flooded. The people saved themselves by scrambling up the mountain for safety and praying to the gods in the land. It evoked as well the Sai, the Thracian pre-Greek stratum, the Thracian word for high, the son of Greek Hermes, or the Greek colonists from Samos. Ancient writers, it seems, recognized the role of toponyms in the negotiation of ownership, as well as the collaboration between colonizing Greeks and indigenous Thracians. That collaboration materialized in activities as diverse as iron-making, burial practices, and the use of the Thracian language in the rites, and helped the Greek settlers become the pioneers of Idrissian trade. That trade was the island's greatest natural resource, deriving entirely from its location. It has little farmland, no great mineral resources, and its poverty was a topos already in classical literature. It was positioned, however, on sea lanes which were laid down as early as the mid-Holocene, 5000 BC, when the connection between the Hellespont and the Bosporus, described by Diodorus, was first fully formed. That rupture set in motion the pattern of currents, among which is the Samothraki anticyclone, a semi-permanent pattern that can be detected through most of the year. This vortex makes the island a far more natural port of call for Black Sea trade than the Cartesian coordinates alone would suggest. These currents combined with winds and anchorages to shape preferred routes as early as the final Neolithic. Out of 6 major prehistoric sea lanes, 4 start or end at the Hellespont. One of these, in red, runs along the Samothracian Pariah. Another, in yellow, passes directly through Samothrace itself. The Samothracian mysteries were established in the 6th century BC, contemporary with the Greek colonization of the Thracian Sea, which was itself undertaken to ensure the transport of grain, as well as wood, gold, and wool, from the Black Sea to the Greek mainland. The promise of the rites was as well advertised as its contents as a mystery cult were secret and preserved in literary, material, and epigraphic form. From Aristophanes' jokes in the 5th century BC to the Hellenistic Nike who looms over the site from the prow of a Rhodian trihemiola to a range of sacred powers, daimonic, divine, animal, and meteorological, helpful to sailors and linked to the rites. Inscriptions on the island raise the potential for us to move from the evidence that this was the promise to an analysis of how it may have worked. Samothrace is especially rich in inscriptions recording those who came to the island's festivals as representatives of their cities, known as theoroi, or witnesses. The festivals provided face time for the Greeks from widely dispersed communities. Relationships were formed, treaties negotiated, and paths of communication established under the aegis of the island's gods. Samothrace granted proxenia to these theoroi, a civic institution which tasked the recipient with the responsibility of acting on behalf of the granting city when he is in his hometown, and it rewarded him and his descendants with benefits key to maritime success. Ataleia, freedom from taxes and port fees; Acilia, protection from the seizure that was the modus operandi of piracy; access to city councils and citizens; and the right of sailing into and out of the harbor, Eisplun and Ekplun, in times of war, times of peace, and in pursuit of commercial exchange. Inscriptions in the Greek cities of Asia Minor, the Black Sea, and the islands reflect additional structuring of social relations under the aegis of the Samothracian gods. Koina, or clubs, priesthoods, local shrines, and processions wove the gods into local hierarchies, cityscapes, and calendars. The clubs integrated Greeks, resident foreigners, traders, and shippers. These ritualized exchanges added commensality and solemnity to bonds of trust that were as essential to long-distance exchange as the harbor rights granted by proxenia. These institutions are among the networks of laws and conventions that created a society of cities in the Hellenistic Mediterranean, capable of stimulating commercial exchange, ensuring the seas, and lowering the cost of exchange. Taxes on exchanges and harbor fees were a principal source of revenue for cities with direct access to the sea. The funds lost through granting autoleia were made up on the one hand by higher net revenues. The equation may also be conceptualized as the market value of the information flow thus enabled. Cities surrendered the income from harbor fees. Individuals surrendered the profits available through the practice of seizure with the declaration of Acilia. These civic institutions are the framework for the realization of Samothrace's maritime promises. They're relational, actualized in person-to-person interactions when access was granted, information was shared, or the rights of seizure foregone. The inscriptions provide us with 116 sites and 819 individuals. Social network analysis lets us gauge the statistical likelihood of their meeting. ArcGIS lets us position these interactions in the geospaces away from the sanctuary itself, the traveling spaces to which the ritual promises were directed. We integrated into these data the historical information on the qualitative differences between different kinds of social action, priesthoods, initiations, and proxenia, ranking them in terms of visibility, frequency of performance, and economic expenditure. The difference between merely numerical data and the same data with qualitative information incorporated can be seen in this graph of a single Proxenia Theoria inscription. Applying this to the entire data set and using the Fruchterman layout, we see the whole Samothracian network as the epigraphy reconstructs it. Edges record interaction at the festivals. Nodes show different values based on local activities. These suggest, on the one hand, new historical foci for further investigation. Miletus, an Asia Minor city that invoked the Samothracian gods in its foundation legend, and one of whose citizen women dedicated an entire building in the sanctuary, is absent from the network. This may reflect lacunae in our data, or raise the potential for some cities to find connections other than Theoria and Proxenia, more productive for their needs. Force analysis shows that Thasos and Aigai played roles as connectors among smaller, more tightly clustered communities of Samothracian affiliates. This suggests a distinctly strong presence of the rites there, which numerical and textual data had not anticipated. It suggests as well that for a number of cities, the closest communities in the network are not those which are geospatially proximal. Rhodes, for example, is far less connected to its geospatial neighbors than it is to locations on the Black Sea. A preference for connections further afield may reinforce the hypothesis of the significance of information sharing through Samothracian ties, as news from a distance is naturally more reliant on highly crafted channels, a pattern with promising analogies in hunter-gatherer cultures. Equally promising is that neighborhood clusters of this sort are consistent with highly clustered, scale-free networks, which may suggest preferential attachment and so open the door to modeling how the system emerged. An ability to model emergence for Samothrace is a promising response to the gap between our Hellenistic inscriptions, which provide spatial and quantitative data, and the earliest literary evidence of a well-known promise. We're far from concluding our Samothracian analyses, but even at this stage, I'd like to suggest some of the gains for Aegean studies from considering Pacific systems. An approach to the rites as social interaction around an ecological challenge, modeled with the water temples in mind, turns on its head the focus on great men which dominated Mediterranean historiography in the age before Brodel, and which is a natural outgrowth of the inscriptions which advertise the great monuments' dedicators. It opens the door to a model of the rites as a self-organizing system focused on the sailors, merchants, and businessmen of the ancient world. It closes the gap between the literary, monumental, and epigraphic data. The focus on civic institutions normalizes Samothrace within the context of Greek religious studies, in which it has been seen as utterly unique, an understandable seepage from the distinctiveness of its gods, its architecture, and its position at the edges of the Greek world. It also offers a focus on what was anciently the least secret aspect of famously secret rites, but which has been hitherto ignored within classical scholarship, and so brings our investigation closer to their lived reality. The question remains what the Aegean may offer the Pacific, and for that, I rely on your perspectives. Thank you.
All right. right, now it is our time for our discussant, Jonathan. The floor is yours, and good luck, and let's have some questions along with it.
Thank you. Fred, I want to thank you very much for inviting me, and to all of you for allowing me to see your papers and try to figure out how they all fit together. This has been absolutely fascinating. I want to start with a recent article co-authored by Steve Lansing along with Yancey Orr and Michael Dove, in which they reviewed ecological anthropology of late. And they open with a quote from Bruno Latour. It's a comment that provides us with a bit of perspective from which to view the papers before us today. Latour is writing about the meaning of the term Anthropocene, and he says, choosing the name Anthropocene brings together three features fairly familiar to anthropologists: the concentration on human agency, the necessity to tackle again the connection between what used to be called physical and cultural anthropology, and the reopening of the key question of what is common and what is specific in the various ways of inhabiting the earth. Is this enough of a gift, or are you still worried that it might be poison in disguise? In addition to the usefulness of this comment in positioning us temporally, looking back upon the Holocene and forward to whatever comes next, Latour's question of what is common and what is specific in various ways of inhabiting the earth strikes me as essentially the same question that motivates the contributions of the presenters at this double session. Our session abstract raises a provocative question. In my response, I will not suggest to you that the papers have answered that question, but I would like to point out surprising correspondences amongst what are very disparate takes on ecology, time, and a sort of regional coherence. And I'd like to turn the question back to you and to our audience to ask whether these correspondences might in fact prove useful in addressing the question. And I will try to limit the time of my comments so that we can actually have a discussion. The statement that guides both sessions today, which was penned by Fred Damon, following some conversations with other members of the panels, proposes a collective project, that of constructing a model of social action since the beginnings of the Holocene throughout the Pacific. The abstract advances the notion that across this region, humans devised a comparatively unique mode of action, evident in landscape manipulations, variable but deep cosmological systems, and modes of production and exchange, through which populations struggled to create the conditions for in situ modes of existence. Fred contrasted these in situ modes, building up and caring for locally managed nutrient pools, for instance, with modes of existence elsewhere in which the depletion of ex situ resources through extraction was the norm. There are at least three provocative and challenging dimensions to this proposition. First, it asks us to do real comparative work. There's an assertion of an essential regional integrity here, and regional projects are necessarily about comparison. Second, cultural anthropologists here today and all around this conference are embarking on discussions of the Anthropocene, but they never really developed the tools or the vocabulary to discuss the Holocene. At lunch, we were talking about this question, the question of time, earlier today, and what seems so interesting to me is that the papers that are assembled here are looking at deep temporal horizons, at time measured in epochs, and incorporate this scale of inquiry into cultural analysis, and that strikes me as innovative and challenging. The abstract, thirdly, grounds inquiry into region and time through attention to at least three dimensions: landscape manipulations, variable cosmological systems, and modes of production and exchange. We might conceive of these as ecological, ideational, and economic systems. Each of the papers take on only pieces of these questions, but read together with the initial motivation in the form of the abstract, they raise interesting possibilities. I'd like to start from the initial comparative question and the suggestion that perhaps there might be a regional integrity to the kinds of social and ecological relations that these papers trace. And I'm going to use just this simple question, this single question, as a way of trying to bring the papers into conversation with each other and then have us sort of engage from there. So the question of Pacific landscapes through the Holocene and the region-making dimensions of that question, especially as they're linked to geography, landscape, environment, and cultures of materiality and of material reproduction, raise the question of the categories according to which regions might be bounded and bundled on the one hand, or in contrast, scattered and set free. Asserting a region is a lumping versus splitting kind of a project. As I was reading Sandra Blakely's paper, I was thinking about Braudèl's Mediterranean, which stands as a sort of ur-text of the kind of longue durée take on the production of region that we're talking about here, although of course he's not pushing his analysis to the origins of the Holocene. It is, however, Braudèl's great accomplishment to have recognized the ecological and geographical underpinnings of the Mediterranean as a regional assemblage. In Blakely's paper, she draws attention to the ways that rights might be seen as forms of social interaction directed at ecological constraints and opportunities. These are social forms that might be constitutive of region-making in each of these two geographies. I think she's quite right to suggest that we have a lot to learn from the kinds of interregional comparative project that she's engaged in this paper. I'm a Southeast Asianist, and the literature on region-making that is a bit closer to home for me includes such efforts as Anthony Reid's discussion of early modern Southeast Asia, George Sedes's thesis about the Indianized states of Southeast Asia, various approaches to upland and lowlands divides and whether those are constitutive of a region in Southeast Asia. For instance, James Scott's work, which we see in some ways in the opposition that Miriam Stark makes between the uplands where the Angkorians stretch into and the lowland states that she describes. Also amongst the regional, the efforts to create a region, O.W. Walter's project to identify the cultural core that might be said to define Southeast Asia. It's in this sense of a cultural core that we can think of the work, for instance, of Stanley Tambaya and others on the galactic polity, or the mandala of power, with its sacred center and diffuse periphery, as the kind of unifying ideational framework that might be said to give some coherence to Southeast Asia as a region. In this vein, Benedict Anderson's observations on the idea of power in Javanese culture seem useful to think with. Anderson also writes about cores and peripheries, but he suggested that the Javanese, like many other Southeast Asians, by the way, conceive of power as material and finite rather than relational and without limit. Anderson's notion of power is interesting because it exists next to the notion of mana that Harry discussed, both conceptually and geographically. Harry describes two models through which scholars of the Pacific have sought to assess hierarchy, one that equates it with structures of coercive power, and a second view, the Dumontian encompassment model, that emphasizes a disjuncture between status and power. Like the Javanese idea of power described by Anderson, encompassment models map the center to the divine both symbolically and spatially. My point here is to place the region-making project that is one of the provocations motivating the work of the two panels today into conversation with other region-making efforts. Along these lines, I wanted to raise a question about the assertion made in the abstract that there's a sort of a distinction between the use in place of resources in the Pacific and the more exploitive socio-ecologies prevalent in Europe and elsewhere. I wondered if there's an overlap between this distinction and the distinction made by Philippe Descola, whose recent works suggest that there is this sort of division throughout the world, not between nature and culture, right? But rather that there's a division between societies in which the nature-culture divide predominates and those in which it does not. So this is, again, it's a process of dividing the world into what essentially becomes the West and the rest. And I wonder if some of that is at the heart of the same kind of question that you're asking. And if so, is there then a regional integrity to the processes that we're trying to trace? Or is something else at play here? Is there something like capitalism at work that might better describe the kinds of distinguishing factors between in situ production of soils and these kinds of things and the more extractive economies? I don't want to go on too long. Another point I wanted to raise was this question of temporality, which goes through all of these papers. And I greatly appreciated the way that this comes out in Thomas Thornton's work on the three epochs in the Tlingit oral literature. placing this analysis of rock cairns within these periods, there's an ecological dimension to temporality at work there, as these stone nests are understood to be flood refuges. And the question of flooding and the way that memory of flooding is encoded within the landscape, within the sort of ritual production of the landscape, and the ways that that then becomes relevant to present day understandings, looking back to the Holocene and these floods, and then thinking through the sort of future temporalities through these cairns and their meanings seems so incredibly productive, and also so closely tied to many of the other phenomena that come up in the other papers that we've seen. Okay, one last way of looking at this. I'm abandoning large swaths of my commentary so that we can all sort of have our own comments and discuss. I had a bunch of questions. The first stemming from this issue of regional integrity. Is there a regional integrity to the phenomena that are under discussion? And if so, does it have its origins in this some sort of, like, if there is a regional integrity, is it because the ecology of the region produces a certain form? Is it because there's a cultural continuum that is addressed towards that ecology? It's a mixture of both, but how might it be explained? And if not by some sort of cultural core, then are we not talking again about a geographic zone, but about something else? Also, two other points of issues that came up and seemed really important in these papers. One, the question of agency, right? Mountains that save people, the dialectic relationship between Khmers and their environment. These things raise some of these questions about agency we were discussing just before we started the session. And secondly, questions of method. The provocation of the abstract is matched only by the heterogeneity of approaches that we've seen, right? So on the one hand, we have epigraphy, we have all of these things: epigraphy, classical philology, oral literature, ritual, structural and ideational cultural analysis of symbolic systems, and at the same time, ecology, agroecology, modeling, GIS, social network analysis, Pareto optimal phase transition analysis, and from what we understand, Stephen Lansing was essentially presenting these insights to discuss them with physicists. So this is the kind of very far-reaching and I would say ambitious sort of intellectual project that I think is so fascinating, that brings together all of these approaches, but also represents a really important challenge for how we talk to each other about the kinds of issues that have been raised here. So, thanks.
I think it might be wisest to see if there's anybody who's sitting here who would like to ask a question or pose something of us. Some of you who are sitting here were sitting up here earlier, but...
Somehow the idea
You want to respond to that? I have a response to that, and one is, of course, that you know, what a region is depending on how you define time and space and a whole bunch of things, and you know, there ought to be a bunch. You know, 5 years ago, I would say, well, you know, 100 years ago they were comparing Australian kinship with India and China in particular. But everybody realized that was ridiculous because the Australians were primitive and, you know, there was high civilizations and all of that. And, you know, one of the things that's changed is we realize the complexity of the human adaptation to Australia. I mean, that's how I understand it, which makes Australia and the Asias now once again kind of interesting because they both did extraordinarily complicated things with their environments. Even though, you know, they're really probably historically discontinuous in some sense. And so, you know, that was one of my thoughts. And, you know, then again, part of the Austronesian history is going big and then consolidating. Now, I knew a little bit of that, but it was actually one of my Chinese friends who was describing Chinese history as that, where you have this bursts out and then consolidations, and the, you know, the Song and the Yuan, and then the Ming closing things off is one of those points where they pull in. So that both speaks to, you know, letting one's sense of the region really expand broadly and also to contract.
Coming at this from a non-Austronesian beginning perspective, I feel like I've been looking through the wrong end of a telescope or something, because I guess what I see more is the pushback rather than pulling back and consolidating. For example, the Trapsala and Sago, which has somehow passed from New Guinea back into the rest of this region, as far as the Philippines and Malaysia at least.
Yeah.
How much other pushback has we seen? How many other things move the opposite direction to create a new regionalization?
I don't know, but I remember once talking in Hong Kong about, you know, what I think about sago and rice as being basically the same thing. And then I got told by a bunch of Chinese scholars that they found that really interesting because there was some evidence of sago into various parts of China and then it getting pushed out. One of the things about that is that rice is far more productive than sago is.
Well, but sago, the Trapsala, is far more productive than the other palms that the rest of this region originally ate.
Yeah.
As Hugh Martin and other British archaeologists are discovering in Borneo that rice came in relatively late. Similarly, the Philippines scholars are just discovering that the Trapsala came relatively late to an area that had other palms.
And it was more productive than them? It was more productive than those other palms? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know that anyone has done direct comparisons, but presumably based on its adoption everywhere it was taken.
Looking to like the Austronesians are the boundary, because their technology requires so much training, concentration, and all of that. So I kind of like things like adopting rice agriculture in some areas. The earlier part, you know, it's rocket science.
Yeah, I think so, yes. This gets actually back, I think, to the technology of rice. There are some times when I think is that a lot of Melanesian culture is intentionally not Asian, in the sense is that it's avoiding the hierarchies. You know, from cooking patterns to productive stuff. And, you know, rice, I think, is also, among other things, a really good instrument of domination.
It's probably not an accident that the Austronesian
Well, you know, one of the things the big temporal and spatial frame that we use for this ignores is minor significant climate changes in the last 5,000 years. These are things that you've talked about in various ways, and I was not aware of the cooling period that you were talking about here, and I don't think there's any question that we need to be focused on that. And you know, I would pick this up as from what I know from my experiences in New Guinea, and that is how close attention people pay to climate and winds and currents and stuff. When I first started asking people about things like that, I'd ask them questions and they say, we don't know. And I fairly quickly realized that they realized that I didn't know anything. And they actually did have sort of big models of stuff, but they realized that it could change any day. And they were focused on watching those changes. And the oceans are necessarily pretty complicated things. And I think we're dealing with people who figured out how to live in them, certainly in terms of the Austronesian patterns. Now, I don't know, I think I have a question with Steve about the rice thing. You know, you've often talked about the relative stability of this system. And I wonder, how long would that be true?
Just done a paper on that, actually, looking at how the subocs in general are very stable, but sometimes they fail. Mm-hmm. So we tried to see whether there were stable patterns of failure, and in fact we didn't find them. Failure is just a transient phase, we think. Basically, when things start to fail in a Balinese village, sooner or later people are going to object and put things back together again, because otherwise the source of income is lost. So it's sort of self-repairing, that's what I've seen. But I have just one comment on the discussion so far. I think Peter Bellwood long ago said that what he saw as really strikingly different between Papuans and Austronesians is the founder-focused ideology, the Ramajas, the idea of the distance from an origin you see in Timor and so forth. And here in eastern Indonesia, you have peoples who are living quite close to each other with sago eaters and rice eaters, but they maintain a pretty fundamental difference in terms of how they organize their society. And I find that to be true based upon what I've seen in those islands. So that was the main theme, right, in the Leiden School from Gosselin de Jong on, that there was a structural core. You could not explain these differences by migrations. There's no need for migrations. There's just a structural core. And Levi-Strauss commented, you know, that it's the Indonesians, not the Dutch, who are the real structuralists. Yeah. Then the question becomes how can that? Jim Fox then commented, I mean, the languages change across the archipelago, but certain terms, the contrast between ama and ina, you know, mother and father and older and younger and so forth, translated into different languages, but nonetheless those concepts, those metaphors, are strikingly similar from Mentawai to Tanimbar. So maybe there's something to that there is something really powerful about those core concepts, and that they coexist with Papuan. I mean, you find some, Lisa, what do you think? I mean, like in Timor, you have some so-called Papuan groups and some Austronesians. Do you think that in the end that Papuans become more Austronesian, or vice versa? But it's identifiable, though, isn't it? I mean, the two cultures are pretty clearly different, even in Timor, where they've been coexisting for, you know, a long time. A long time, yeah. I sometimes think that, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And yet when you're abutting a society that has this different form that may be equal to us, then how is it that that difference is maintained? Because it's not, I suspect, going to be maintained in terms of an analysis of difference. It's going to be explained either in terms of things like there are fundamental structural differences in the organizations of a society or something like that, or there's going to be something that maintains those kinds of boundaries, not forever, but in quite a long-term period of time. So I think the relationship between what one might say conscious decision making and knowledge of the operation of the system, and just some other kind of either preference or the incompatibility of adjacent systems, say marriage or hierarchy, something like that. So how are those boundaries?
One of the things that I first thought with my coolering research, and then I sort of think, well, this is part of the Asian thing, is that things are organized by differences. So people fundamentally think that the next place over there is different, and that's not a problem. And whereas that's not exactly how we think about our society. And I wonder about this in terms of Steve's stuff. If you're some model, you replicate somebody who's next to you. And I would, I sort of think is in the coolering, you want to make sure you're different from the person next to you. And I don't quite know how that works.
Well, in Balinese case, it's just the simplest rule we could think of. It's not what really happens.
Yeah.
It's just to see how easy is it to move to an adaptive solution. We could add many more different kinds of rules. They'd probably all wind up in the same place. That was the idea. In fact, we tested a bunch of different rules. Sorry?
Well, and that's where it's a big kinship. There's the question about is there anything that could be borrowed in the Austronesian work or the Australian. And I think the sort of, I can see analogies in huge amounts of aspects of kinship systems, but also in certain things to do with watering practices, primary, secondary, tertiary areas, and relationships between ancestral beings and place. But I think that they may be in terms of some deeper kind of so that they weren't associated with Austronesians. They were things that were before Austronesian movement came into that region of Eastern Indonesia. So that's what I'm saying. I think these regional and temporal that they've got to be placed in terms of actually the fact that there may have been very, very different worlds 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, but some areas, I think in Indonesia, in Australia, they carry it forward.
Well, one of the presumptions here is that people actually figured out how to live in these environments, and environments didn't change all that much until basically the European order came in and redefined everything. I think it would be wise to question the distinction I've raised between in situ production and always going into extraction. But I'd also say, there's a real difference between what people coming out of Western Europe did and what the rest of the world did. So there's something to that, I think. One of the questions I was wondering about for you, Sanders, what happened when the Vikings arrived in the Aegean and the Black Sea, and what did they do? Because they did get there, yeah.
Samothrace is just like Faust pieces when the Romans get there. So
yes. All right. Okay.
You're way out of my historical time frame here, but in terms of the kind of intercity network that the Greek city-states put together, once Rome comes in, and it's ironic because Rome is on Samothrace like a duck on a June bug. They're all getting initiated. They say that it's a cosmological system. They say things that no Greek ever said about Samothrace, and they make it completely theirs. But with the Romans' massive sea power, there is an 800-pound gorilla in the room. They clear the Sea of Pirates. Pompey the Great does it in 3 years. And all of these honors that are, in practical terms, holding the Mediterranean together, they become nice little bits of cultural polish, but they don't have any effective use anymore. Yeah. And then, of course, at the end of, by the time you get to the 5th century and Rome is falling, then you see a real leap in regionalization and vulnerability, and one petty chiefdom can take over another island and another one down here. So the Pax Romana, which followed this Hellenistic, the Hellenistic systems are constantly balancing against the political wranglings of one place to another, and the amount of change in the system is constant. So what you need is something intensely flexible. And when Rome comes in, it's solid, and it lasts until about the 4th century. And then with that, once the Roman army falls because of lack of financing from the center, and lack of political centralization in Rome, then this Mediterranean goes back to being deeply chaotic, but those Hellenistic systems aren't going to work anymore. So they're a distant past.
When the Vikings came into Constantinople, they liked them, they were loyal to arts.
They left graffiti in the Hagia Sophia. They were thugs. But I think actually that's a very good example. They were hired by princes, but in terms of a systemic kind of situation, again, I mean, they would have just fed into these post-Roman localization forces. They wouldn't have done anything to actually create those networks to pull it together.
Okay. I'd actually like to go on talking, but we probably should eat first. Okay, so.